Our next speaker is Jennie Cramer. She is going to talk about principles and practices of ecological gardening. Jen is a senior resource educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Putnam County, with a degree in horticulture. Oh, I'm sorry, Jennie. I'm writing the wrong Jen. I'm so sorry. Spoiler alert. I need more coffee. Where's my coffee? Jennie is an educator. I got that part right? With Cornell Garden-Based Learning. She is an ecologist turned enthusiastic horticulture educator with 25 years of experience in organic gardening, with agriculture, natural history, and botanical education. She is especially fond of teaching students how to create a resilient, abundant, and beautiful garden ecosystem by applying ecological principles. Thank you, Jen.
What's your plan? You know, honestly, I've always wanted to be Jen Lerner, so that was my moment. Okay, how's the sound? It's loud to me. So you heard I'm Jennie Cramer. I work with Cornell Garden-Based Learning. And before I start the slideshow, I want to tell you how I came about getting so interested in ecological gardening. Historically, back in another lifetime, I was a professional ecologist. I worked in forests and then I worked in prairies. And I mostly focused on restoring prairies and forests to reintroduce endangered plants. So ecosystem restoration. During that time, I would work all day in the forest and then I'd come home and garden all night. And then one day I decided, wouldn't it be cool if I could just work in gardening? And so the lens that I think of the garden through is an ecologist's mind. And so I'm going to transport you all a little bit back to maybe high school, maybe college, but I'm going to teach you how to think like an ecologist and think like an ecosystem in the garden. And some of you know and are maybe curious and have heard I'm writing a book about ecological gardening. On your thumb drives today, you're actually receiving the first half of the book. We're asked, it's not published yet. So we ask you don't share it, like don't email it to all your friends and be like, look how awesome this is. The publisher probably not love that. But I also wanted to mention that a lot of the principles that you were learning about today, this is where the book is going. And is it published? That's a great question. It's according to the first grant I wrote, it was going to be published in December 2022. So your guess is as good as mine at this point. Okay, so I bet a lot of you have been hearing this phrase, ecological gardening. And for me, when I first heard this phrase, I, as an ecologist, was wondering, like, well, what are people talking about? What is their definition? I've also heard the phrases regenerative gardening. A lot of you probably know about permaculture. How are they different? How are they the same? So I am a curious person and a former researcher. I jumped into the primary literature and just, looked for papers on ecological gardening. And there aren't any. There actually are no papers that use the phrase ecological gardening. So then that led me to the question, what is it then? And so there's a few books out there on ecological gardening. So I got them out and looked for consistent definitions that I could find on the internet or in these books. And they're completely inconsistent between books. So I felt, as someone who was teaching ecological gardening and a former ecologist, that I would be the one to figure out what is ecological gardening. So I elected myself. Okay. So here's the definition that I came up with so far. And I would love to have feedback if anybody in here has an ecological background. This is all material that's going into the book. And so I love wonderfully compassionate critiques. So I love that from you. Ecological gardening is using the patterns and processes in nature as a template for a garden ecosystem. So it's really basic, right? We're just thinking about what would nature do essentially, and we're applying that to the garden. There's a couple of things that we know about ecosystems. They minimize inputs. So there's not something coming from outside of an ecosystem to make that ecosystem what it is. They maximize biodiversity naturally. There are a few ecosystems that are better at that than others, but in general, they maximize biodiversity. And also they prioritize, just by the nature of evolution, the health of the living things that are in that ecosystem. And so what we're going to be doing is thinking about how we apply those to the garden so we can get these natural processes back on the landscape. So now I'm going to introduce you to what I've decided, single-handedly sort of, are the principles of ecological gardening. And this is where I'd love your critique. And so this is all emerging from basically an ecosystem model that I learned in graduate school. I went to the University of Vermont, Department of Botany, the Field Naturalist program, where a fella named Hub Vogelman, if any of you know who Hub Vogelman is, an amazing human being, he's no longer with us, came up with a model. He called it the pieces, patterns, and processes model for explaining ecosystems. And it turns out that it is so wonderful for helping to understand the garden. Okay, so the first thing I want you to know, the first principle is that your garden is an ecosystem. And ecosystems contain three things: pieces, patterns, and processes. And they keep it functioning in that way. And I'm going to tell you now about what those three things are: pieces, patterns, and processes. So if you're going to remember three words, remember pieces, patterns, and processes. Okay, so there are living and non-living things in an ecosystem that are interacting. We all know about that, right? There's living things like plants and animals, and non-living things like wind and soil. Well, we could argue if soil was living or not, but you understand the mineral parts of the soil at least. And then the presence or absence of certain elements is what define that ecosystem. So, for example, forests are defined by a certain density of trees. And you could ask the question, let's say you have a goldenrod field in your backyard and you don't mow it regularly and a tree invades. Is that a forest? What about when 5 trees invade? Is it a forest yet? When does that field become a forest? So these are definitions that help us define ecosystems. Okay, so let's talk about pieces. So these are the elements in your garden, they're both living and non-living. So here's some examples: soils, plants, rocks, bees. You see all these options, everything you plant, individual species, individual things, and they're just, you're a piece of your garden. Then we have patterns. This is the relationship of those pieces on the landscape or even in time. So I'll give you some examples here. An example of a pattern would be that ferns thrive in the shade in general, or certain ferns do, and we would identify those. Hummingbirds prefer red and pink flowers. That's a preference. It's a pattern. We can see it replicate itself on a landscape. Blueberries grow better in acidic soils, right? And you get the idea, right? And so once we understand these patterns, we can start to figure out how to replicate those consistently in our garden ecosystem. And that's what some of what you were doing today when you were outside, right? And with some of these other talks is we're understanding the patterns of, for example, of the natural enemies and the plants that they prefer, the conditions that those plants need. Okay, processes. So this is where it gets pretty nerdy and sciencey, and I think this is where a good gardener can become an amazing gardener, and especially a very resilient gardener. This is really where we're going to restore our garden to a true ecosystem. So the processes are what keep the ecosystem and its inhabitants functioning in a predictable-ish way, and there's feedback loops. So there's these cycles and there's these feedback loops. Before I pass it on, does anyone who hasn't heard of this presentation before, give me an example of a process? Any guesses? When you see that? Yeah. Decomposition, perfect. That's a great example of a process. Okay, so here are a list of some, not all, of the processes that you would see in an ecosystem and in your garden ecosystem. So we have photosynthesis, nitrogen fixation, predation, right? You heard about predation in the bird talk this morning. And then again, when we were outside with Jen and Amara, predation is a critical piece of the garden ecosystem. Pollination, decomposition, and the list goes on and on and on. And I'll keep going from here. So with these core ecological gardening, there's some core ecological gardening practices that we can use to restore those pieces into the right patterns and also to bring back all of those processes. So a lot of times when we have an imbalance in our garden, let's just say we have a pest we're getting consistently over and over and over again, we're missing one of the processes, right? We're missing the predator, or maybe we have a nutrient imbalance that's making it possible for a certain weed to thrive. So we have to restore these processes. So how do we do that? This is where I really love this part, because this is where the academic rubber meets the road. What do we do in our gardens? Like, what can you go home and do right now to restore your ecosystem? So I've broken this down into what I'm calling 8 core practices. And I'm going to blow through 8 core practices in 16 minutes. Okay, core practice number 1 is to build living soil. And I want to tell you that the way that I came up with these core practices is I spent a lot of time, honestly, sitting in a forest meditating and looking around me and thinking about like what's happening here. What is the ecosystem doing? So, for example, a forest ecosystem, you know, through the process, I mean, of course, there's the weathering of the rocks that has happened over time, but through the process of decomposition of all the beings that live there, it continues to build its own living soil, right? So this is the first core practice. And so within this core practice, I've just listed some things that you can do in your soil to build living soil. And a lot of these are like going to be no surprise to you, but what I really like about this model is that it really breaks it down into a super doable thing. And what I would encourage you, especially those of you that are master gardeners, especially if you're a newer gardener, is to think about that we're not going to employ all 8 core practices and all the elements of all those practices in the first year. It's going to be like Becca showed us, where it takes 5 years to create a habitat. So I want you to think about it in that way. And I encourage my students usually to pick 1 or 2 core principles or practices to really focus on in a given year, and then, you know, build from there. Okay, so these are just basics, and we're going to blow through this. Sometimes I take an hour and a half to give this presentation. But you all know this. We want to keep our soil covered. We want to use cover crops. We're going to add organic matter, and if we want to build diversity in the soil, we want to add as many types of organic matter as we can. It's like having a potluck where if everybody brings squash, not so great, only the squash eater is going to eat. We want everything there, so that means adding lots of kinds of organic matter. In some cases, we need inoculation or re-inoculation of some kind because we actually have organisms that are completely missing from the system. We have to improve water and nutrient retention. Some examples might be just adding organic matter, using biochar. There's lots of other ways. And then, of course, minimizing soil disturbance is a big one. Hint, hint for your quiz. Okay. Core practice number 2, this is maybe my favorite one, maximizing living plant cover. Okay, so we see a lot of gardens where we have these discrete plants, but really an ecosystem is going to try and trap all of the energy and all of the light that's coming out of the sky as much as it can. This is why any spot you have that a weed can grow, it will grow because the ecosystem needs to trap all that light for it to be efficient. And so that's why a forest has many, many layers. And so we can do this in our garden to maximize living plant cover. So important detail of this is to remember also that this is affecting the soil as well. And when we're maximizing living plant cover, it also is going to help us diversify the roots. We want to diversify the roots and the lifespan of different plants. This will help us maximize the cover just by each part of the ecosystem having a different strategy. This is one thing that's always interesting to me because I see people pull out their lawns and replace them with rocks or wood chips or things like that. And it's a great stepping stone, but actually plants are always preferable to non-plants. Non-plants don't store carbon, they don't photosynthesize. They're skipping a lot of steps in the ecosystem. So we want to find ways to do that. And if we're paying attention to a lot of the methods we've learned today, we don't have to use like weeds or invasive species to do that. We want to utilize as many layers of the plant canopy as we can. I don't think Becca mentioned this morning, but vertical diversity is one of the key indicators on whether or not a habitat will be good for birds. So the great news is vertical diversity provides habitat for birds. It also provides better habitat for pretty much everything, and then it stores the most carbon. And then, of course, companion planting and interplanting and cover crops are great ways to fill in places where we don't have, a featured plant. Okay, number 3. I was going to say, last one I said was my favorite. Like this one's my favorite. I think they're all my favorite. Okay, maximizing diversity. This is one where I really love the concept. I think when we think about maximizing diversity, a lot of times we just think about different plant species. There's actually so many types of diversity we can be thinking about in our garden. Plant height, right? We talked about, we have all these different beneficial insects. Well, some of them forage on the ground, some of them forage at knee height, some of them forage up in the canopy. We need to have all the different plant heights represented. Of course, diversifying by plant family will bring into the ecosystem all these different biochemical things, right? Like brassicas have different things in them than a different plant family, right? Bloom time, fruit type, right? We learned about birds this morning. Certain birds like certain kinds of fruits. Plant lifespan is maybe one you don't think about, but in an ecosystem, there's a lot of turnover, and we need plants of different lifespans to be able to capitalize on that. So we need annuals, we need biennials, we need short-lived perennials, and then long-lived perennials. And we need to be thinking about having them all in there. And then if you want to get really nerdy, you can start to diversify by root type. And that really actually does affect the soil flora and fauna, right? They're all feeding on the exudates from different roots. Different types of roots put out different things. So fun to get a little nerdy. I think you guys are figuring out by now, I'm pretty nerdy. Okay, core practice number 4. So some of you from Master Gardener program have heard the phrase right plant, right place. I've added right time to that because I think especially with all our climate fluctuation that we have, it really is critical to get your plants in the ground at the right time. Those of you who planted your tomatoes or peppers on May 15th can attest to that, yes? Okay. So what are some of the things about right place, right? Yeah, it's hard to say. Try and say it. Right plant, right place, right time. Whose idea was this? So maximizing the health of your plants is like critical to reducing the inputs, but also we learned a lot about the timing that needs to be connected between our plants and the beneficial insects and the birds. A big piece of this is site assessment and making sure that you know what environment you have. And I know for a lot of us, like this first thing we want to do when we're designing a new garden is put plants in the ground, but I really encourage you to hit pause on that one, and maybe like get something in the ground, but really get to know a site and a garden before you start planting. Always start with healthy plants. Work with your climatic conditions and the microclimate. So I don't know when all of you had your last frost, but I know the variability in Tompkins County where I live there was a lot of variability on the last frost date this year. And that had to do with people's microclimates. And then this is the trickiest part, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and we're going to hear from Ashley about this, is when you're thinking about the right plant, the right place, the right time, considering future climatic conditions. If you're going to put an apple tree in the ground and it's going to live for 100 years, it's going to experience some very different climatic conditions than what we're experiencing right now. We want to be thinking ahead about that. Okay, number 5, integrate your garden. So Becca talked about this too. I was so excited when she talked about integration. We want to be adding perennials to our annual landscape and adding annuals to our perennial landscapes. So a lot of us have our orchard over here, and then we have a pollinator garden, and we have a veggie garden over here, maybe a little bird garden. But I want to start thinking about our gardens as one landscape, one garden, and integrating them all. Vertical diversity is really critical for creating habitat, especially for the birds, but really for pretty much any living thing. It's also really nice for us to be able to capitalize on a piece of ground, to be able to have things that are harvestable at different times of year, and that vertical diversity will contribute to that. You all know this isn't new, but the roots of woody plants providing critical habitat, and then also beneficial insects and pollinators. They need habitat for all the stages of their life. So a lot of times we're thinking a lot about what they need to eat. And that's super important. But once they eat, they also need to drink, they need to reproduce, they need to overwinter somewhere, and we need to provide all that habitat. One of the things that we've heard like a couple times today is if you build it, they will come. So one approach could be, learning exactly what lacewings need for every stage of their life. Another approach could just be like, put everything out there and you should have the bases covered, like have the diversity. And forest gardens and food forests are really wonderful ways to integrate this. Okay, number 6, I felt that this deserved its own practice, even though I could have kind of integrated it into other ones. create habitat for beneficial invertebrates and their allies. And this goes a long way. We think a lot about pollinators, and we heard about natural enemies today, but there's more than even just that. Seed dispersers, who's dispersing seeds, right? Native, and then trap crops are really important if we're going to do some pest control. I think I love native plants, and I'm also not an only native plant person. I think there are some other plants that are really important, especially for restoring the soil. Sometimes some of our native plants they just aren't growing fast enough or producing enough biomass. If, for example, you need a ton of organic matter, we want to be moving toward ecosystems that have more native plants, so really important to be including those. Also, I heard Jen and Amara, I was very happy when Jen and Amara mentioned, like, sometimes the native plants are now out of sync with some of our important critters, so including some more non-natives for diversity can be helpful. Okay, number 7, nothing goes to waste in an ecosystem, and it doesn't need to in your garden either. We're going to minimize that. So you can build fertility at home with compost, with chop and drop plants, which are just plants that you cut and leave in place, horticulture, and enhancing your soil microbial ecology with lots of methods that are available out there. Focusing on utilizing local resources and plant nurseries. So an ecosystem, well, thanks to us, actually, ecosystems do import organisms from other places, but they're not supposed to. And of course, with a nod to Petra, save seeds, let your garden be the source of the best seeds for your landscape. And when you don't have them, go get them from Petra. Okay, number 8, adapt to and mitigate for a changing climate. So this is one of the things that ecosystems are incredible at. So ecosystems have been changing throughout time, adapting to the climatic changes. We've been having climate change, just not human caused, for all time, and ecosystems shift and change to accommodate that. Species come, species go, and we need to be doing that in our gardens. So choose plants that are resilient to early and late frosts. Obviously, we're all really attuned to that this year. Maximize the number of varieties you have for a given species so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket. Have many things blooming all the time, we know that. Store water for drought resilience. And I'll add to that, build soil organic matter for both. I mean, what I love about flood and drought resilience is that you pretty much do the same thing to prepare for a flood that you do to prepare for a drought. So we'll be building lots of soil organic matter. Use all the practice we've talked about to build your water holding capacity, fertility, habitat, and your pest resilience. Choose varieties wisely. Start to think about your beneficial insects. The pests that we have right now are not going to be the same ones we have later. So that's number 8. And I wanted to mention a couple of things before I'm done. I can't believe I'm finishing on time. It's like this must be a lucky day. I didn't even have coffee. So a couple things. One, I want to tell you about, I think most of you know about this book that I'm writing. And today I've been feeling, I have moments where I'm not feeling great about it. Just that's what happens, I think, when you're at the end of writing a book. But today I felt really good because one of the things I'm going to be providing at the back of the book, which you didn't get today, is have to hold something back, is I made a list of the top, what I call the top 150 plants for your ecological garden. So one of the things that often overwhelms me is I'll go to an event at the Lab of Ornithology and there's the bird list of plants. And I'm like, oh, cool, I'm going to plant all these. And then I go to another presentation and it's the list of plants for beneficial insects. I'm like, oh, I'll plant all these. Then I go to a food forest workshop and it's all the edibles. And I'm like, oh, cool, I'll plant these. And then a soil workshop and there's a different list of plants. And so I often feel like my head's going to explode when I'm trying to accommodate all those things. So I've made a spreadsheet that is basically the top 150 plants and the criteria to make the list where you had to provide, at least you being the plant, 3 ecosystem services, and there were a number to choose from. So it could have been a benefit to the soil in some way, such as nitrogen fixation, or actually large quantities of organic matter would have qualified you. It has to be resilient to at least zone 5. It can't have any major pests or diseases. There's more criteria that I'm forgetting right now. Anyway, and then it had to meet, so these ecosystem services. So it could be, it had to either provide habitat for birds, habitat for beneficials, soil building, water resilience, food or medicine for humans. I considered that an ecosystem process. So in order to make the list, you had to have 3 of those. So I scoured the Mars list, and I scoured Betsy's list, and I scoured the Lab of Ornithology list, and I read all those books, and I've consolidated all so that you could have a list that you just take to the nursery, get those 150 plants to start. You'll be hopefully making. I'm currently accepting sponsorships from nurseries. I'm just kidding. So that's about it. And I also want to tell you really quickly, I am here representing sort of 2 places. I'm work at Cornell with Cornell Garden-Based Learning, and I also have my own business. It's called Garden Rhythm. And I teach ecological gardening online to audiences, not just in New York State, but all over the place. And it's really fun. And I would love for you to go sign up for my newsletter as well. Okay, I'll take questions.
Thank you, Jenny. We have 2 minutes for questions. Do you want to? We probably need to use the microphone for the people that are online, so.
Okay. Thank you for that. It was really great. And I have a question that's probably a very difficult one, but as we know, historically gardens are designed and what something looks like, their appearance, the aesthetic experiences of them are a big part of what they are. So how do you, how do your gardens, what do they look like? And how
That's
do
a
you
great question.
accommodate the, after the 8 principles, then what?
Yeah, in a longer presentation, I would love to have like lots of photos. So you will not believe this, but I'm actually a fairly tidy gardener, relatively speaking. I'm not the tidiest. So I think there are a lot of elements we can bring to our gardens to tame the wild. For example, all my beds are edged nicely. And when you have a garden that is super diverse, and then you have an edged bed versus a not edged bed, it really looks different. I also include a lot of stonework in my gardens, and I have a lot of artwork in my gardens, but I'm also cautious about which plants I choose for which gardens. So I have some gardens that look pretty manicured. I mean, they have massive plant cover, but there's a design, and I have things planted in 3s, and there's a design. I have a garden that's a purple garden, and it's all purple, but it also happens to be a food forest. So I think we can mix those elements. And I think also as you, especially for those of you with larger landscapes, you can think of like the zones in permaculture, and the things by your house can be really tidy and refined. And as we move farther and farther out, there's room for a little bit more stochasticity and chaos so that the wild can do its thing. So I think it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
What about control versus influence and succession?
Tell me more what you mean by control versus
Control
influence.
is the sort of what I consider traditional gardening, where you're going to get out there, you're going to control everything you have. What's your view on control versus influence? And also, what are your long-term views on succession?
Yep.
Does that enter your thinking?
It does a lot. And it's interesting because I actually went back and forth about whether I wanted succession to be a core practice. And I decided it wasn't. Yes, not. So like even a principle, right? So it's like, is that in there? And I was like, no, it's in there. And in fact, in the processes part, succession should be on the list. I'm a both and kind of person. So when you're talking about control versus influence, my answer would be yes to both. And I think that the more we build our ecosystem, the less we require control. But in the early stages of the ecosystem, got to have more control. And I can tell you that in my garden, there are certain things where I'm like, oh, I've got the companion planting strategy down for this pest. I don't have to do any control. And then like Colorado potato beetle, like I don't have that down yet. So I think that it's definitely a both and. And then in terms of succession, especially when we're planting for vertical diversity, you can't get too attached to things. Like you start with an open landscape, you plant trees, it's going to become shade. And I think as gardeners, we have to be ready to move plants and lose plants. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up succession. Thank you. I'm going to make sure I write about that.
How can we have public gardens? Public gardens are looking to almost stay the same rather than to have succession happen to them.
Yeah, so I think this goes into the both and piece of it, of like, there's not every landscape is going to become a functioning ecosystem, and there's a lot of value in the beauty and the historical nature of some of these public gardens. And I think that also the thing I love seeing is where the public gardens can demonstrate to people how to integrate ecosystem services and still keep the beauty in the landscape that people are working on. So it's again, it's a both and. So we preserve what's important to us. And I certainly have favorite plants and then not favorite plants. And you're not going to find my not favorite plants in my garden, no matter how much habitat I create, right? I'm just like, I don't really like that plant, but I'll find another plant that fills that niche. So yeah, I think that they're all so valuable. And of course, having these places where gardens are a little bit more discreet and obvious, they're great educational landscapes. Like if you want to teach somebody how to manage apples, you probably do want to teach that in an orchard. So I'm not saying get rid of all of that, but I'm just saying, and especially in our home gardens and our landscapes, let's start thinking like an ecosystem and restore the patterns and processes.
Thank you.
Thank you.